Hey everyone, Emmerron here. So this week for How to GM, I wanted to talk about a topic that I kind of alluded to last week, and that is the concept of social power gaming. So I think a lot of us who have been in the RPG space for a long time, especially those of us who are GMs who maybe made a mistake with balancing our fights or presenting appropriately powered enemies against our players, we understand one kind of power gaming really, really well, and that is statistical power gaming, where a player will buff their stats or skills or optimize them in such a way that it makes playing a challenge to them very, very difficult, especially in those situations where they are the only one who is optimized and the rest of the party is trying to play what some of us may consider fair. Or we could just simply look at it as optimized versus unoptimized, right? If you have one optimized player and several unoptimized ones, it can be very difficult. So in Cyberpunk, there is a second kind of power gaming, and it's a little more subtle and it's a little more nefarious than outright statistical power gaming. So we've already talked about statistical power gaming to a certain extent in a previous How to GM video on using hardened enemies in your combat design. Ultimately, that is going to be your best out when your whole group is statistically power gaming. That can also be useful when you've got two or so power gamers out of like a party of 4 or 5 total players. You could kind of adjust that in there, and that kind of solves your problem, at least at low levels. And it only really stops becoming a fix if you get into really like what we have in Neon Inferno, which is we're now 20 episodes deep and the players have had all that time to accrue gear, money, etc. So that's going to solve your statistical problem. But so let's talk about social power gaming. So what is social power gaming? Well, the idea starts with a life path. So in the Cyberpunk Red core rulebook, and if those of you who are new are using easy mode, you'll notice this as well. When you are rolling a life path for a new character, regardless of what role they're playing, there are a finite number of outcomes per those roll tables. Now, some GMs may look at that and say, that seems very narrow. That seems like not fully encompassing the breadth and width of like what's possible out there in the world. I assure you that that list, for what it gives us, it is vague enough to account for nearly all scenarios in the game that would be reasonable. And that's the key word, reasonable. So let's examine for a moment, not so much a story from my table, but one that I've heard echoed over and over and over again in social spaces for the game, between Reddit, Discord, etc. So newer GM starts off their players, and you get everyone else in the party except for this one player who roll on the tables, and they kind of adapt those life paths. And they're doing this without any real guidance from the GM for the most part. They're just kind of taking the rolls and running with them. And the inexperienced GM gets approached by this last player, who then inquires, well, GM, I had a different idea for my character. And novice GM, not knowing any better, says, okay, sure, let's run with it. And so that player, having that more or less carte blanche from the GM to write their own life path, writes themselves a life path that is utterly inconceivable for the start of a game, right? They are some kind of corporate bigwig's son who is estranged, but they have a ton of money or resources at their disposal in terms of like reputation. They have, these really convoluted parts in their backstory where they know a lot of really important people. But, and this is where it gets problematic, because like some of you out there are saying, okay, well, Emmerron, like that's just their fucking backstory, dude. Like can't they have fun? Like, are you against players having fun? Yes, I am against players having fun. Why do you think I play this game? To have fun? I'm kidding, entirely kidding. I love this game because it is fun, and I want to keep it fun, and that means keeping it fun for everybody. So here's what happens when that social power gamer gets that carte blanche. They ride it entirely too far, and now Novice GM has a huge problem on their hands, because Novice GM gets 2 or 3 sessions in to this campaign that they're running, and it becomes really quickly apparent that this player is going to regularly steal the spotlight because they're able to pull the, well, don't you know who I am card in every social scenario. They get approached by some big booster gang boss or something. This bigwig kid just pulls out, for no reason that they've earned, I'm important. I'm a corporate son, right? Like, my dad is the CEO of Militech. Like, they aren't. Like, I'm sorry. They're just not, right? No rank 4 rep 0 edge runner is going to be anyone of note. Like, if you turned up a bloodstain in the alleyway tomorrow, you would not be remembered. Like, that is the fate of most dead rank 4 rep 0 characters, unless the crew they are with chooses to remember them, or they did something incredibly noteworthy in their last minutes. And those are all earned, right? They don't get to just write a backstory that says, I am important, I am powerful. No, you are a nobody. You are going to earn that place of being known, of being powerful, of being someone notable. Those are all things that you have to play for keeps and win. So now that we've kind of expressed what the problem is, let's kind of watch that scenario play out. So we get into a situation where the crew has been sent to essentially assassinate someone who is very powerful in a corporation, right? It's a suicide mission for any regular rank 4 rep 0 crew. So they're being sent on this suicide run from a fixer who doesn't really give a shit whether they live or die on the other side of this. He's gotten them enough of an opening to go in, get the shot, and maybe that exec is dead. The crew may not live to see the escape, but at least the target's dead. So the fixer gets their cut, and that is where the interesting stuff should happen, right? So now let's look at this character who has socially built themselves to be important. Well, now the crew goes in, the gunfire starts, and all of a sudden this little weaselly person is able to say, well, I'm important. And because of their backstory, like, the GM would feel probably inclined on some level to give them something, right? Maybe not total freedom or total amnesty from the scenario, but they're going to give them something, right? They're going to give them some point of leverage that, again, this person at the first or second session, they haven't earned that, right? So now let's examine without them there. The crews rolled their backstories on the life path chart. Well, now they're pushed up against a much tighter wall. And that's where they should be. They should be in danger, unless they've done everything right to make sure they're not in danger. An example from my table, when one of the players that now plays in Neon Inferno actually with me, Erica, the first night that she played Cyberpunk with me, it was her, my wife, playing, and then me as the GM, and I ran them through essentially the scenario that I just mentioned. They were sent to a corporate-owned hotel in a fairly secure part of the city where they knew a bigwig from Arasaka was staying, and their task was to get in and kill him and then get out. That was their goal. And they persuaded their way in. Neither of them was important in any way, shape, or form, but they either persuaded or hacked their way in and then convinced the guards to leave their posts with some very good persuasion rolls. And then when it came down to it, it was them, the exec, his escort that are, completely naked in the room. And they go in for the kill, pay off the escort, tell her leave. And now, that went perfectly for them because they did everything right. But it was tense. I remember them getting there, and there was a probably 15 to 20 minute discussion as they were getting out of the car about how do we want to run this? We're 2 people against an army of hotel security. How do we get in, quietly off the guy, and get out? And they figured it out. But if they had leverage heading into that 20-minute discussion wouldn't have happened. And those of you coming from D&D might be looking at that right now as a GM and saying, well, it's just the raid prep, right? If those of you who've played MMOs like World of Warcraft know, you don't just run in and pull. You've got to strategize first. You don't want to Leroy Jenkins that shit. Well, yes, that's true in an MMO. And those of you in D&D are but man, I hate when that happens. It's awful because then my party plans out and trivializes my challenge. And then it's very difficult for me to get them on board. And some of you may be already saying, countering that, saying, whoa, Emmerron, that's not me. I know how to design around a party, which is good. That means you're probably experienced. And this part of the video specifically is maybe not as much for you as it is for a bunch of the amateur GMs that I've seen post up on social media. So the first step to any gig is it should involve dilemma. There is no gig that goes perfectly for your crew unless they work for it to get done perfectly. And even that might not be enough. If you look at the Konpeki heist from 2077, you will see the massive amount of prep that went into that gig. Quite literally, you do 3 or 4 gigs just in preparation for that one final gig to go perfectly. And then it goes anything but. Everything goes tits up. And then at the end of the day, you end up alone, your friend dead, and you are sitting there wondering what the hell comes next. That is what Cyberpunk gigs are. If you want a perfect example of what a high-risk Cyberpunk gig looks like, the Konpeki heist is a really, really good one. It really does tap into everything that you should be employing as a GM in terms of toolkit to make that feel good for your players, but also make them feel like they are constantly against the wall. There should always be unknown pieces moving. There should always be people in the shadows ready to take them out if they move the wrong way. There should always be a constant pressure of some kind looming over them if they don't act quick enough or smart enough, or if they just aren't good enough in the wrong moment. So all of this to say that when your crew is socially balanced by the rules, this all goes way smoother. And to further emphasize that, I want to share another story from my table, this time from Neon Inferno. So let's talk about the players' backstories that started this campaign all the way back in session 1, because we're nearing the end anyway, and a little bit of reminiscing does me good. And I think for those of you who haven't seen Neon Inferno, this should probably emphasize, if you're only catching up now, exactly how far we've come. So session 1 of Neon Inferno, the party composition is this. We have a rocker boy in the character of Pixel. We have another rocker boy in the character of Estrogen Light Rail. We have a solo in the form of Hyde. And then we have 2 net runners, Ghost and Red Eye. And those 5 characters all were either from the streets in some way, as was the case of both Netrunners. The solo was also, I believe, from that same backstory. We had the first rocker boy was quite literally just a BD entertainer, adult entertainer, let's just say. And finally, Pixel was a street kid of a kind, but she's there by choice. She is there because she has run away from her corporate family, who she has grown nothing but sick of. And she understands that they're probably going to look for her father most of all. So now I want to pause there and mention, so she comes from a corporate background, but she has chosen the streets, and she's chosen them for a reason. And her naivety about them is part of what comes through with her character and makes her charming. And it makes sense then why she wouldn't be known, right? Her dad isn't some big exec. He's like a local military protection gang. And like, sure, like his protection company maybe has enough business to give her a good, upbringing, pay for her education. Like she describes it, I grew up in star scrapers in the city, but that's as big as it gets. Like she lives in a nice place. She's got good, education. Her family's rich enough to be considered rich, but not like international syndicate rich, right? They are still limited enough in their scope that without there being conniving in the background, we don't get to her being overpowered. And so we get this at the start. Now, fast forward a couple episodes to episode 4. We've lost one character by now, which was Estrogen Light Rail. Her girlfriend, Electo, has now taken over as part of the crew, as their tech. And they have been sent to seal a submarine. Now, the submarine is something that they discover her father and the company he runs is after. And she pulls the card one time. She gets to pull it exactly one time. I am Samantha Green. I am the daughter of the CEO. You will let me pass. And they let her pass. They let her get into the sub. And that's when they realize the mistake they've made when they radio to base. And all of a sudden, it turns very, very ugly for them. In the very next episode, the entire party nearly gets killed because of her and the fact she pulled that card. That is how you have a character who is maybe in some ways socially privileged, but they come with a whole lot of blowback. They come with a lot of things that then go wrong, not because of choices necessarily that they've made, but because of how powerful the people looking for them are. And the fact that when they reveal their hand to that extent and they become known by that, like, oh, look at this crew I'm running with. Well, now they get easier to find. And that is what that can look like when it's not, oh, I just know these people. It's, I know them. I want to get away from them. I'm actively running from them. Another quick point I'd like to address is if you are a GM for whom this has already happened, right? You've already made the mistake. You've written the carte blanche for your player and they've gone way beyond the limits that you thought were reasonable. It is never a bad idea. It is never a problem for you to say, hey, player, I think we might need to revisit your character's backstory just a little bit, because I think it may be a little out of balance for the world that I'm trying to create. So never be afraid. There is a tech rule and I mean this as the role tech in the book, called invention, where your tech can literally try to invent anything they want, right? It is the book giving the player somewhat a carte blanche. But even that rule specifically says, check with your GM. You may have to revise the item you create several times mechanically for it to be balanced and fair in the game that your GM is running. So do not be afraid as a GM to take that same approach with this. Be okay having that discussion with your player and saying, hey, player, I just feel like this is not working. It's imbalanced. It's just a little too much, which is also why I recommend when players are rolling their life path, roll the life path with them. Sit there with them. Be part of that discussion. Not only because they get to then, I guess, get better input from you when they're doing something like this. If you are letting them off the rails a little bit, I'm not necessarily entirely against that, but it needs to be within reason. It needs to be looked at from an objective lens in terms of what are they getting away with? What are they including? What are you okay with them having? And you have to understand when you get off the rails that balance issues come up way faster than when you just stay on the pre-written rails. So if you are a new GM, always I recommend stay within the lines. Don't try to color too far outside of them. Stay within the lines initially, especially for your first couple games when you don't know what's going on, or if you're rolling your first campaign up. There's always time to introduce interesting aspects to characters later that go beyond the vanilla life path. Remember, as much as it does allow you as GM to have tools like enemies and other characters to pull into your story to support the narrative you're creating, that's the biggest part of what a life path gives us as GMs. It is also just their backstory. That does not need to be where all the interesting stuff is. The goal is to make the present more interesting for the presence of those items on that life path list. So again, just to quickly recap that idea, don't be afraid to tell your players no. Don't be afraid to tell your players we need to revisit this or revise this somehow because it is not working out. Or if you are going to let them off, make sure that you're having that discussion. And even if you aren't letting them off, I would always encourage being there when they roll their life path, because there are some questions that you can ask them to enhance the life path further. And that is what we will talk about next week. So definitely, if you're interested in that, please tune in. I will love to discuss that with you all. So that pretty much explains what it is. This is one that I definitely feel is less of a numbers game, and it's more of an art than a science, simply because it is one of those things that, like, you have to kind of play a little bit to understand exactly why this is implemented the way it is in the book. And it is something that I think we all get better with time, because the initial reaction we have as GMs to Cyberpunk Red's setting, especially depending on where we've come from in terms of like the games we've played in the tabletop space. I think if you're coming from a system like D&D, which again, I've said before on this series, I know most of us have come from D&D at some point, or at the very least we have touched it or played it at some point in the past, to understand that that system does not build a ton of organic, like, stake built conflict, if that makes sense. Like, you're not going to get something that is a ton of like visceral stakes in D&D without there being a very good GM at the head of the table. But Cyberpunk intends to build that kind of a world from the ground up. The system builds that from the ground up. You are not meant to survive or accrue any real power in the world. You are meant to die. And the longer you cheat that, the better and better you become. And maybe the more impervious you become to dying. But it is never far off. It is never a long distance from you. It is always right around the corner. It should be staring you in the face. And no one and nothing you know should be able to fully stop that, right? Never should be able to cut that off. So I hope that this helps. Again, as always, and probably more so with this subject than others I've discussed on this channel, I definitely would love for you to ask any questions in the comments below. I very well would be, happy to doing a follow-up on this topic, because again, I think that it requires a little more community discussion. To that end, I also have my Discord that I link in the description below, where if you come there, we do have an Ask a GM channel, where not just myself, but several of my friends who are also GMs that I know in real life are there to answer some of your questions. And I would love for you to come in and ask your questions there. We have a very helpful community, and we love talking to new players, especially new GMs. We love supporting you. So please don't feel afraid to come and ask. We would love to help you. But I think that's going to just about do it for this week. Again, my name is Emmerron. If you feel I've earned it, please drop me a like and a subscribe down below. And as always, I hope wherever you are in the world, you have a wonderful morning, evening, or afternoon. Stay healthy, stay safe. And until we speak again, peace.